All right, everyone, welcome back to the conclusion of Hannigan's long-running tale. We rejoin him in his vengeful quest to the Capra headquarters, chasing down Valentina Koppel for what she did to his family and his town. I hope you all enjoy the final part of the Neverglades mysteries, Devour. The gate, as it turned out, was already bent into pieces of twisted metal when we arrived. The earthquake had really done a number on Capra HQ. Most of the pavement out front had been split into shards, and the roof of the compound seemed to have caved in on one side, making the building look like a large creature trying to lope its way out of the lake. Still, there were lights on in the windows. Somebody had apparently thought ahead and built a backup generator. "Look," the inspector said, pointing through my windshield. A narrow structure stood on the roof's highest point, sort of like a tiny radio tower. A single red beam issued from the tip and ran all the way up to the rip above. I picked up the walkie and radioed Marconi's cruiser. "You seeing this?"
"I think we found our guys," she crackled back.
We parked our cars under the cover of the trees and approached the entrance, weapons drawn. The forest was dark, but the purple glow of the rift revealed the outline of two armed men standing by the mangled remains of the gate. Marconi signaled to me, and we circled around them, keeping our pistols raised. They hadn't seen us yet. For once in my goddamn life, the element of surprise was on our side. "Hey!" one of them shouted, and both lifted their assault rifles. The inspector had appeared on the road in front of them. His eyes were burning like dots of cold fire, and his coat whipped behind him in a sudden gust of wind. The guards prepared to fire, but Marconi and I leapt out of the tree line and got each of them in a headlock, making them sputter. One of them pulled the trigger and sent a volley of bullets into the air that missed the inspector by miles. It took a bit of flailing, but eventually the men went quiet, their eyes rolling back in their heads. Marconi and I dragged them into the forest and stuffed them behind a fallen log. "You think anyone inside heard that gunfire?" she asked me. "Probably," I said. "We better move fast." The inspector had already strolled over the tangled gate and was approaching the front doors. I noticed a tiny camera on the roof swivel in its perch and follow his movements. Angry blood rushed through me, and I placed a bullet in the center of the lens. The camera whipped around with a spray of shattered glass. "They've got eyes on us," I said. "Move, move!" The inspector lifted a hand, and the doors crumpled inward like they'd been turned into cardboard. Another gesture, and they blasted across the inside of the lobby. They struck the golden sea and climate with a clang that echoed throughout the room. The ensuing crash as they fell to the floor was loud enough to wake the dead. "If they didn't know we were coming, they know now," Marconi muttered to me. We followed the inspector indoors. Sure enough, a keening alarm split our eardrums as soon as we crossed the threshold. Red warning lights flashed across the walls. I could hear the sounds of distant yelling and the clomping of heavy boots. "Into the labs," I said. "We have to find Koppel." "To get her to close the rift?" Marconi asked. I stared down at the pistol in my hand. The metal felt cold under my fingers. "Yeah," I said. "Something like that." Footsteps were approaching, so we ducked down the same hallway as before and hurried past the locked laboratory doors. The water had washed away, but the aquarium was still empty. Yellow caution tape stretched across the gap in the glass. At one point, we had to stop abruptly and dart down another hall as a swarm of armed guards ran past. The inspector waited for them to disappear, and then gestured for us to move. I wasn't sure how we were going to find Valentina, but then I heard a familiar, breathy laugh, and I skidded to a halt outside another laboratory door. The sign on the front read Quantum Particle Research Lab. Beyond the door, a crowd of happy voices laughed and cheered and applauded as if someone was giving a victory speech. My blood began to boil. These scientists didn't care that my son had died. They had made a major fucking breakthrough, and that was all that matters. Someone popped the goddamn champagne. I kicked open the door. The scientist standing at the nearest desk looked up at me, surprised, but I didn't give him the time to shout for help. I raised my pistol and squeezed the trigger. The powder lit, the bullet rocketed out of the chamber, and the man's head whipped backwards, a puckered red hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He seemed to sway, his lab coat billowing out, before his whole body just went limp and collapsed onto the floor. Blood pooled, slow and sticky, onto the tiles. Someone at the back of the room let out a cry of outrage, but the cry turned to a burbled sputter when I turned and planted another bullet in his throat. Chaos erupted. There was a flurry of white lab coats as the scientists ducked behind desks, tables, chairs, wherever they could find cover. I strode around the room and picked them off one by one. They cowered, they screamed, they held up their hands in pitiful protest, but I ignored their pleas. I could feel something dark surging inside of me, something not altogether alien, and I didn't fight it. I let the cold anger fill my veins. There was a ringing in my ears, and it wasn't until I felt a sharp tugging on my arm that I realized Marconi was screaming my name. I continued to unload my gun into a corpse at my feet until the barrel clicked and I was firing empty air. I kept pulling the trigger until a sharp blow on my cheek knocked me against the wall. Marconi had slugged me in the face. "Jesus, Hannigan," she shouted. "Are you a cop or a fucking psychopath?" I dabbed at the blood on my lip, my fingers coming away a vivid red. For a second, Marconi's words started to sink in, and then I heard a clatter from behind me, and I turned to see another figure in a lab coat slipping out the door, her long blonde ponytail whipping behind her. "Koppel," I seethed. I dodged around Marconi and chased the fleeing scientist, who had just enough of a head start. I fumbled for some extra ammo as I ran, slipping it clumsily into the gun. Then I fired 3 shots at Valentina's retreating back. All 3 missed, but the last one was only by inches. I saw it rip through the folds of her lab coat before she ducked around the corner and disappeared. I followed her down another hallway, just in time to see a door closing about halfway down the corridor. My shoes pounded on the tiles as I ran over to it and yanked it open. It was the same room where she'd taken me the last time I was here, or at least it looked awfully similar. All the little details were the same, down to the glass beakers and microscopes and the large shape in the corner, hidden under a gray blanket. Valentina spun around as she heard me enter. I fired a shot into the wall just above her head. She ducked down and huddled against the blanketed shape, her tablet clutched in one pale hand. "Call for help, and I'll put a bullet in your brain," I said. "Now put the device down and slide it over to me." Valentina did, slowly, keeping her other hand raised. She pushed the tablet across the tiles. I lifted my leg and stomped on the transparent screen. The glass crunched and shattered as I drove my foot into the floor, leaving little piles of glassy dust. "Do you have any kids, Dr. Koppel?" I asked. She hesitated. "A daughter," she said at last. "Vanessa. She left the Glade at 18 and went to study physics in Chicago. No idea where she went from there. I haven't heard from her in years." "This morning, I had 2 sons," I said. "Now I only have 1. Your little earthquake knocked down our house and bashed his head open." Valentina didn't say a word, which saved her life. If she'd offered some insincere apology or started yammering about collateral damage and the greater good, I'd have plugged her between the eyes. She stared up at me, inscrutable as ever behind her glasses. Her hand still lifted in a tense surrender. I tightened my grip on my gun. "You're thinking I'm going to go on some revenge crusade," I said. "That I'm going to track down your daughter and make you feel what it's like to lose a kid. You got it all wrong. I'm not going to kill Vanessa. You did that yourself the second you opened that rift and let in the Leviathan." I curled my finger around the trigger. "Thanks to you, we're all going to die. If you happen to die sooner rather than later, well, it's no skin off my back." There was a click as a gun cocked somewhere behind me. I turned my head to see Marconi standing there, her pistol raised and pointed straight at my back. The inspector hovered behind her. His expression was flat, but there was something disapproving in his eyes. I laughed. "You're going to shoot me, Sheriff?" I said. "A giant space whale is about to eat the entire world. You think a couple more dead bodies is going to make a damn bit of difference?" "I don't care if the world is ending," she said in a surprisingly quiet voice. "Drop your gun, Hannigan." I looked at the cowering scientist with loathing. "Give me one reason why I should let her live." "Because we need her," Marconi said. "And because this isn't you, Hannigan. I know you. You're a stubborn son of a bitch, but you're not a killer. You're letting yourself be controlled by grief and anger. When you finally cool the fuck down, you're going to see that. Now drop your fucking gun." "I'd listen to her, Mark," the inspector said in a low voice. My finger twitched on the trigger. It would be so easy to just squeeze the damn thing and send her brains splattering against the wall. The strangest feeling of déjà vu came over me. I'd been here before, or somewhere like here. That dark anger surged inside me, but I gritted my teeth, trying to swallow it down. With immense effort, I reached out and placed my gun on the counter beside me. The inspector darted forward and grabbed it. My heart was thudding like a jackhammer, and I could barely look at Valentina without seeing red. "Make yourself useful, then," I said shakily. "Close the fucking hole in the sky." Valentina jumped up at once and yanked at the massive gray blanket. It slid off the circular shape and hit the floor with a thwomp. Underneath was a large control panel with a mirror-like object jutting from the top. Inside the frame, reflected on a strange metallic surface, I could see a reddish bird's-eye view of the rift. Even on the screen, the sight of the void sent a dull thrumming through my brain. Valentina's fingers danced across the panel, pressing the buttons at speeds I couldn't even begin to follow, Window after window popped open, asking for confirmation, authorization, password, finger recognition. Valentina bypassed them all with the dexterity of someone who's worked with computers all her life. Eventually, the device grew dim, the red light faded, and the beam retracted from the rift. We stood and watched, waiting for the rip to seal. But the seconds passed and the gash in the sky remained as stark and present as ever. "I don't understand," Valentina said with a trace of panic. "The splicer's powered down, I swear. I don't know why the rift is still open."
"Turning off the device won't work," the inspector said. "That beam was like a butter knife, sawing at human skin. Scrape at it enough and yes, you'll break through. But if you remove the knife, it doesn't heal the wound. It just stops the sawing."
Marconi and I exchanged an uneasy look. "So, how do we close it?" she asked.
"The same way you'd close any deep wound," the inspector said. "You cauterize it. If we could channel enough energy, we might be able to seal the rift. But it would require an immense amount of explosive force, and..." He paused. "It would have to be done from the other side. Throwing energy at the rift from down here would only make it bigger."
"So we're gonna need some kind of bomb," I mused, "and a way to get inside the rift." I paused. The inspector and I looked at each other, and bam, the puzzle pieces fell right into place. For a moment, I forgot about my rage towards Valentina. "The helicopter," I said, just as the inspector said, "The explosives." "Excuse me," Marconi said. "Is anyone going to tell me what's going on here?" She lowered her gun, that usual disgruntled tone coming into her voice.
"Right here in the facility, we have a source of energy and a way to move it," the inspector said. "But we have to move quickly. There's no telling how close the Leviathan may have gotten by now."
I grabbed Valentina by the arm. She made a brief effort to wriggle away, then gave up, and marched her out of the lab. The inspector swooped by me and glided down the hall as if he knew exactly where we were going. Marconi eyed me skeptically, but she followed me as I led Valentina after the inspector and into the heart of Capra. I kept expecting guards to show up and open fire, but the halls were eerily empty, and no one disturbed us as we made our way down the corridor. We finally reached our destination. I let Valentina go and pushed her towards the door. There was a keypad and an eye scanner on the side that hadn't been there the last time we'd broken in. Valentina tapped in the code, scanned her eyeball, and opened the door. We found ourselves staring at those same big blocky letters from before. Caution, explosives. We stepped inside, drifting carefully among the cartons. Marconi whistled. The boxes stretched off into the dark corners of the room, each emblazoned with that same black warning. "There's 100 sticks of dynamite in each container," Valentina said. "And this is specialty stuff. One stick can destroy an entire city block." She eyed the inspector warily and said, "Would that provide the amount of energy you need?"
"And then some," the inspector muttered.
I bent down and peered between the cracks on the closest box, making out a stack of chalky red tubes. I withdrew quickly and took a hasty step back. "Why does Capra need so many fucking explosives anyway?" I asked Valentina. She stared into the sea of boxes. "Backup plan," she said tersely, "in case things go wrong." "Like now?" Marconi asked. Valentina nodded. "Like now." She assured us the containers were safe to move, so we reluctantly got to work dragging them out of storage. The inspector lifted a few boxes like they were made of used tissue paper, but I was barely able to lug one of them on my own. Marconi and Valentina grabbed one each, and together we followed the inspector out into the hall. He seemed to remember the way better than I did, so I let him lead us through the winding passages. The doors flew open at his approach as if they'd been triggered by motion sensors. It didn't take us long to find the door leading out to the helipad. The helicopter still sat there, all sleek in black finish, its massive blades hovering like dragonfly wings at rest. I was beginning to think we were actually going to get away with this when the clomping footsteps of guards echoed through the corridor. "Freeze!" a voice barked from behind us. The inspector didn't even turn around. He swung his hand back and a sudden wall of stone sprouted from the floor of the corridor, thudding into the ceiling. Another swarm came barreling around the corner, but the inspector waved his hand and sent a second wall shooting upwards. There was a chorus of gunfire as the guards unloaded on the inspector's makeshift barriers. I tightened my grip on the box and hurried towards the helipad. "We're surrounded," I panted. "How the hell are we going to get out of here?" "One step at a time, Hannigan," Marconi said. "Let's close that rift before we worry about anything else." We burst into the cool morning air and were immediately hit by a blast of wind from above. The Leviathan had stirred in the void, sending ripples through the sky. Every step we took was on rumbling ground. We lugged our boxes to the helicopter as carefully as we dared and deposited them in the back. When Valentina placed down hers, she reached inside and withdrew a long, snaky fuse. She placed it on the floor of the cockpit and backed away gingerly. I'm not sure you've thought this through, Valentina said, once we'd all gotten clear of the explosives. We can't just fly this thing via remote control. Someone's going to have to be on the inside to light the fuse. You wanted to see behind the rift, didn't you, Dr. Koppel? I said. Well, congrats. Here's your fucking chance. What? She asked, startled. You are going to take that helicopter, and you're going to fly it up into that tear, I said. It'll be easy. The autopilot will take care of the tough stuff. Then, once you get inside, you're going to light that fuse and blow this baby to kingdom come. Boom. One big explosion, and the rift will be sealed. For a second, I thought Valentina was about to run, but she must have realized she wouldn't get far. A strange heaviness came over her face. She turned her eyes up to the rift, where the Leviathan was letting out another great yawn in the distance. The ground rumbled again, a few seconds longer than the last time. I suppose I don't have much of a choice, she said. This is really it, isn't it? If I don't go up there and detonate enough energy to close the rift, we're doomed. We're all doomed. There was a rustle as the inspector stepped forward. His fedora was tilted up, revealing those piercing purple eyes, and the smoke from his cigar curled in lilac spirals. I came to Pacific Glade to serve humanity, he said to Valentina, as did you in your own way. Everything you did in the name of progress, of understanding. You wanted to know more so you could do more, so you could improve the human experience, but your curiosity pushed you too far. And that being up there, he gestured with a slender finger, that hungry beast will undo all the hard work you've ever done. Your life will have amounted to nothing. But if you do this, your life will mean everything. You will single-handedly save the human race. All that work you've put in to make the world a better, safer place. That work goes on. Isn't that what matters? Valentina looked at him, then at Marconi, then at me. The wind grabbed her hair and sent it billowing around her face. I stared into her eyes and wondered what she was thinking. But she didn't say a word. She only nodded. The ground gave another rumble, and she began walking towards the cockpit. The three of us watched as Valentina climbed aboard and headed for the dashboard. She stared at the controls for the moment, and then took a seat and flicked a switch. The blades whipped to life, picking up speed until they were a circular gray blur. Then the helicopter began to rise. Guards pounded against the walls somewhere in the distance, but I could barely hear them over the whir of blades and the animal roar of the engine. The inspector, Marconi, and I stood and watched as the last hope for humanity lifted off the helipad. The wind whipped around us and blew pebbles into my face. For a minute, I actually dared to believe this crazy idea would work. But as the helicopter swung around, giving me one last look at Valentina's face, a worrying sensation twisted my gut. Something was wrong. It was the gleam in her eye, the tiniest of smirks, not at all the expression of someone embarking on a suicide mission. And I knew, in that split second, that Valentina had no intention of flying up into that rift. She was taking this helicopter full of explosives and piloting it far, far away from here. Probably to find her daughter one last time. She was going to leave the whole world to be devoured. I acted before I could stop myself. Bounding forward, I leapt off the rubbery surface of the helipad and heaved myself into the cockpit. Marconi's cry alerted Valentina, who glanced back at me, taken off guard. I took advantage of her confusion to scramble to my feet and charge her. She reached into her lab coat, possibly to draw some unseen weapon, but I grabbed her skull and bashed it against the dashboard. Her hand fell and she dropped to the floor, moaning. The helicopter had started to tilt, so I leapt at the cyclic stick and yanked it back. The cockpit steadied and righted itself. I hadn't flown since those long-ago days with Peter, but the instincts came rushing back, and I settled into the controls with a surprising sense of ease. We were still rising. I took a seat and adjusted the collective lever to increase our ascent. Valentina had slumped against the side of the cockpit, apparently unconscious. I let myself look down. Marconi had a stunned expression on her face, like someone had wound back and punched her in the chest, but I could barely see her from here. Her body was shrinking beneath the shadow of the helicopter. The inspector stared up at me from beside her. His eyes were hidden beneath the shade of his fedora, and his mouth was drawn in an expressionless line. But there was something solemn about his cigar smoke. It was a dark, billowy maroon, and it floated up after me like a hand waving goodbye. I swallowed and forced myself to look away. We were getting closer to the rift now, purple light spilling from the gash in the sky. I scanned the control panel and pressed the promising-looking button. 2 reinforced doors slid shut on both sides of the helicopter, muting all sounds from outside and sealing us in the cockpit. My heart thudded as we rose higher and higher. Then a shudder, a tearing sound, like someone ripping a piece of paper, and we were past the barrier. The world outside the windshield turned into a mind-splitting void, and I heard a creak as the glass adjusted to the sudden vacuum. If it shattered, we were fucking doomed. But the windshield held, and my migraine lessened, and I was able to stare out into the nothingness. Except it wasn't totally nothing. The Leviathan filled most of the void above us, its mouth gradually opening like a whale preparing to inhale krill. This close, I saw that its body extended farther than I'd originally thought. It rippled back into the abyss, huge yet snake-like, its tail drifting lazily through the starless sky. The sheer size of it sent a tremble through my body. What chance did we stand against this thing? If we didn't seal the rift, I had no doubt those jaws could open wide and swallow the entire world. The air behind me seemed to contract, and when I dared look backward, I saw a familiar starfish shape folding into existence. Its solid red eye opened wide, and its tentacles curled up on the ends like tiny muscles flexing.
"Hello, Purple Man. I have come to end."
"What the hell is that thing?" Valentina shrieked. I hadn't realized she'd woken up. While I'd been distracted by the Leviathan, she'd crawled towards the pile of explosives and pulled a tiny blaster out of the folds of her coat. She aimed it at the Ender with shaky hands. I felt a surge of fear rush through me. "Don't!" I shouted. "If you break the windshield, we're done for." Valentina ignored me and fired off a single shot. It was a spark of brilliant light like the atom blaster in miniature, and I had no doubt it would vaporize the glass in a heartbeat. But it had been a good shot. The light bullet struck the Ender dead on and sent a splatter of black liquid across the cockpit. The creature didn't fall, though, and when it turned to face Valentina, I could see livid veins popping across its starfish skin.
"Purple Fish dares to attack the Ender. Oh no, this will not do."
The beastie moved faster than I would have thought, flinging itself on Valentina's face and wrapping its tentacles around her head. She shrieked. For a second, I was afraid she'd let off another shot and kill us all, but the blaster fell from her hand and clattered across the floor. She flailed for a bit, then went quiet, as if the Ender had injected her with some sort of sedative. A horrible gnashing filled the air, like a set of sharp teeth grinding together, and a sudden spurt of blood splashed across the doors. I nearly screamed myself as the Ender gnawed at Valentina's neck, its body inflating in and out like a pufferfish. She didn't make a noise as it drained her dry. Then it turned to face me, blood dripping from its tentacles, leaving Valentina's pale corpse behind it. I'd like to say my last thoughts were about Ruth, or Rory, or Stephen. I'd like to say my whole life flashed before my eyes. That's what happens in the movies, right? The hero gets one moment of peace before the big finale. But I was no hero. Sure, I'd saved a few folks and stopped plenty more from dying painful deaths, but a lot of that boiled down to the inspector. He was the real hero here. And the truth was, the Neverglades needed him a hell of a lot more than they needed me. At least I could go out saving the people I loved. In the end, all I thought was, I hope it doesn't hurt. The Ender's sticky tentacles slapped against my face. I could feel its sucker sinking into my skin. I fought the incoming wave of wooziness and pulled my lighter out of my pocket. For a second, I was afraid it wouldn't light up here, but the helicopter was airtight, and the little flame burst into life. I leaned down and touched it gently to the fuse. The thin rope burned away, the spark crawling across the ground towards the pile of wooden boxes. I looked away and stared into the maw of the Leviathan. Those great jaws were open wide now, so impossibly wide that they blocked out all view of the void. Tiny specks glimmered inside the creature's cosmic gullet. Despite the hissing of the fuse, despite the suckers digging into my skull, I found myself smiling. "What do you know?" I said. "It's full of stars." The Ender's teeth stabbed into my neck, and it hurt all right. Oh, God, did it hurt. I staggered against the window and left a spatter of blood on the glass. That fucking starfish bit like a mini shark. I could feel my consciousness draining, but I forced my eyes open and stared blearily out of the cockpit. I stumbled forward until I was practically slumped against the control panel. The fuse behind me went quiet, and in that fraction of a second, the world turned kaleidoscopic. I gazed into the Leviathan's glittering universe and thought I saw a tiny speck of purple amid all those stars. The cockpit was as silent as the glade on a cold winter night. Then the explosives lit, fire blossomed around me, and I was gone. I hope you've all enjoyed the conclusion of Part 8 of the Neverglades Mysteries. There is a reason that Hannigan's words have been recorded here, even though he didn't make it back from the rift. And I'll get to that in a couple days. I hope you've all enjoyed the ride. As always, I'll include links to the original post, the artwork, and the music that I've used in the description down below. I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.